Good evening. My name's Christine Smitka, and I'm the Acting Director of the Centre for Literatures in Canada. I'm so pleased to be with all of you here this evening for our 17th annual Kreisel Lecture by Wayde Compton. I would like to begin by sharing something I learned on September 30th when the University of Alberta was closed for the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, which is also known as Orange Shirt Day. As part of this day of reflection, I participated in a walk guided by knowledge keepers and local historians from River Lot 11, where there's a beautiful Indigenous art park, down over the Walterdale Bridge to the Rossdale burial ground. On this walk, Carla Badger, who comes from Sucker Creek First Nation in Treaty 8 territory, explained to our group that many people mistakenly think that treaty acknowledgements are something that arose in the wake of the TRC's findings. However, she corrected this notion, explaining that this is a much older tradition, one her family practices every time they enter someone else's territory. It helps her and her family reflect on the types of relations they wish to foster. This learning experience has changed the way that I hear treaty acknowledgements. For example, we are about to hear a talk by Wayde Compton, who's here to talk to us about Anti-Racist Poetics. Therefore, when I acknowledge treaty, I could ask myself, what does it mean to engage in this intellectual tradition from here, Amisquiche, Waskagan? How might our thinking be inflected by virtue of our location on Métis Region 4 and Treaty 6 territory, which is a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. At the CLC, we've been reflecting on our location and talking about Canada as a location, which is to say a place in which literary production occurs, rather than as a unified cultural identity. It is for this reason that we have recently changed our name from Canadian Literature Centre to Centre de littérature canadienne, to Centre for Literatures in Canada, Centre de littérature au Canada. This name change does subtle but important work to signal multiplicity, conveying a coexistence of literary traditions. In this tradition of multiplicity and community, I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge three of our partners. Glass Bookshop, which is now located in a beautiful location in Ritchie, right beside Kind Ice Cream. The University of Alberta Press, which is publishing tonight's lecture as part of the Kreisel Lecture series, and CBC, particularly CBC's Ideas, which has broadcast so many of our Kreisel lectures. At this time, I would like to welcome Dean Robert Woods on stage to open this evening's event with a welcome from the Faculty of Arts.
Thank you, Dr. Smitka. Good evening, everyone. My name is Robert Wood, and it's my privilege to serve as the Dean of the Faculty of Arts. Welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight. As many of you know, the Kreisel Lecture is an annual event hosted by the Centre for Literatures in Canada. This lecture series was established in memory of Professor Henry Kreisel. Professor Kreisel was Chair of English and also Vice President Academic at the University of Alberta in the 1960s and 1970s. Austrian-born and Jewish, Professor Kreisel was interned in Canada during the Second World War. As a war refugee, he spoke of being an accidental immigrant to Canada and how, as a newcomer, he went looking for Canadian literature, but no one could tell him where to find it. And so he took matters into his own hands, introducing and teaching the first courses in Canadian literature at the University of Alberta, and inspiring a love of the written word in generations of students. Notably, he was also one of the first modern writers to introduce the immigrant experience to the field of Canadian literature. The CLC honors his legacy through the Kreisel Lecture series, just as the Faculty of Arts is committed to honoring and supporting the literary arts and spreading awareness about the importance and the value of Canadian literature. The annual Kreisel Lecture is not only a celebration of Canadian writing, but it's also a recognition of the importance of public intellectual exchange. In the Faculty of Arts, we are proud to be home to the Centre for Literatures in Canada. This successful research center tackles key societal issues in its role as the Western hub of the Canadian literary community. It is a forum for open, inclusive, critical thinking and cultural engagement. And it also works to bring together authors, readers, researchers, students, and teachers from across the country. I would like to thank our friends at the CLC who all make this possible, in particular, Dr. Christine Smitka, the acting director, and her entire team at the CLC. Thank you as well to the University of Alberta Press, which co-publishes the Kreisel series with the CLC. And of course, I would like to express my deep gratitude to Eric and Alexis Schloss for their generous founding gift and for their continued support over years. Dr. Eric Schloss proposed the original concept and vision for the CLC because he saw the need for an organization devoted solely to the study and promotion of Canadian literatures in their widest context, nationally and internationally. In addition to donating more than 40,000 books to University of Alberta libraries and supporting annual lectureships on human rights and the Holocaust, the Schlosses established a Centre for Literatures in Canada in the Faculty of Arts in 2006, the only national bilingual literature centre in Canada. We remain forever grateful for their generosity. It's now my pleasure to welcome to the stage Professor Michael Buckner, who will introduce our speaker tonight. Professor Buckner is a specialist in Black Canadian cultural production and also the Tier 1 Canada Research Chair nominee in the Department of English and Film Studies. He's also an expert on African diaspora, Black Canadian cultural production, post-colonial literatures, and critical race theory. Intersectional approaches and decolonial politics are central to his work. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Buckner.
It is not. It is not. It is not. It is not. It is not enough. It is not enough to be free of the whips, principalities, and powers. Where is your kingdom of the word? It is not. It is not. It is not enough to be paused, to be whole, to be void, to be silent, to be semicolon, to be semicolony. I must be given words so that the bees of my blood's buzzing brain of memory will make flowers, will make flocks of birds, will make sky, will make heaven. The heaven open to the thunderstone and the volcano and the unfolding land. I must be given words to refashion futures like a healer's hand. Good evening, one and all. I invoke the drum chants of the Barbadian international poet and thinker, Kamau Brathwaite, as a salutary ululation to literary sound ancestors, and a choric libation to acknowledge my privilege to be a guest on these indigenous ancestral lands, as well as to honor racialized and other subjects who occupy this space. It is also a distinct privilege to be asked to introduce this eminent literary giant of Western Canada, the cool, dignified, not quite diminutive Wayde Compton. As far as I was across the oceans in Jamaica, over 2,000 nautical miles from Vancouver, I had heard rumblings and rumors about Compton's literary prowess and the significant work he was doing in British Columbia. His reputation had spread so far and so wide from Western Canada to the misnamed West Indies. But it was not until a visit by a Vancouver scholar from Simon Fraser University, whom I had hosted on behalf of the Department of Literatures in English at the University of the West Indies, and also the West Indian Association for Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies, that I came into textual knowledge of him. That visiting writer sent me a copy of his collection of essays, After Canaan, Essays on Race, Writing, and Region, which traveled from Vancouver, Canada, to Kingston, Jamaica, and back now to Edmonton, Alberta. I will now have to press him to autograph this copy, and with this public announcement, he will be obliged to do so. Fellow Canadian writer David Chariandy describes this collection this way. Wayde Compton is among the most brilliant and accomplished Black Canadian writers of his generation, and the release of his first collection of essays is great cause for celebration. After Canaan explores with equal passion and acuity the archives of history and the live acts of contemporary culture. It links a unique landscape of Black presence to the most urgent global debates on the politics of race and space. These are exemplary essays, culturally rooted, intellectually borderless, and brimming with soulful style. Indeed, it is a rich collection of essays burgeoning with ideas about Afro-peripheralism, multiculturalism from below, racial misrecognition, disciplinary impositions on Black writing, the urban renewal Black removal conundrum, acoustic intervention as schizophorophilia, and disunified identity inter alia. The arguments are provocative, generative, and managed judiciously from the scalpel of a literary and cultural surgeon. Compton's ideas have been so generative that literary critic Heather Smith has suggested that from the vantage point of Afro-peripheralism, he has produced new routes of inquiry about Black lives and heritage in Canada, recognizing the Black Pacific as an important corollary to Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic, frames of inquiry for the complexity of Black lives nationally and globally. According to Heather Smith, and I quote now, in its critical dissonance, the term Black Pacific alludes to the unexpected cultural connections and commitments we can witness when diaspora grows in their respective locations. Compton's work thereby resonates with or anticipates Black historical work in Canada by such figures as Fanuel Antwi in his 2011 PhD thesis, Literary Currencies of Blackness in Upper Canadian Texts, and his current CLC project in Black Arts and Epistemologies, or Karina Vernon's 2008 PhD thesis, Black Prairies, History, Subjectivity, Writing, and her subsequent book, The Black Prairie Archives. Such work has recovered significant portions of Black history in Western Canada. His historical research record matches his attention to community building with such initiatives as his co-founding the Hogan's Alley Memorial Project in 2002, a grassroots organization that promotes the history of Vancouver's Black community. Also, recognizing the significance of institutional support for creative writers, he founded with David Chariandy and Karina Vernon the first Black Canadian literary press in Western Canada. Now that deserves a round of applause. He has also been anthologist, editor of Bluesprint, Black British Columbian Literature and Orature, and co-editor with Renee Saklikar of The Revolving City, 51 Poems and the Stories Behind. So far, I have introduced a creative artist who is aware of genealogical connections to the Black artistic tradition, to Black ideas, and to Black history. Yet beyond his recovering and archiving activities in respect to Black Canadian lives, he's a significant creative voice. He's the author of 2 books of poetry, 49th Parallel Psalm 1999, which was a Dorothy Livesay Poetry Prize finalist, and Performance Bond, 2004. Praise for his first collection of poetry has come from the likes of George Borrowing, who announced him as our own DJ historian arrived at last. According to Cynthia Sharp, quote, wrapped in psalm, his musical rhythms play out profoundly as he brings to life the echoes of lost voices in a lyrical anthem of crossing the border to Canada, to different encounters with racism, struggles and triumphs, placing daily experiences of often unseen, untold narratives more prominently in collective memory. This multifaceted creative has written one nonfiction book after Canaan, already referenced, which was shortlisted for the City of Vancouver Book Award. One collection of stories, The Outer Harbour, 2014, which won the City of Vancouver Book Award, and one YA graphic novel, The Blue Road, illustrated by April de la Noche Milne in 2019. Compton has performed his sound poetry at events such as WordFest, Calgary, Banff International Writers Festival, Fuse at the Vancouver Art Gallery, and Toronto's Omiala Festival of New Black Culture. Formerly the director of the Writers Studio and Sound Bank Writers Program at Simon Fraser University Continuing Studies, he's currently the chair of the Creative Writing Department at Douglas College. Wayde Compton is a poet, historian, graphic novelist, essayist, short story writer, anthologist, sound poet. In this particular moment of racial capitalism, with so many emergencies about the vulnerabilities of Black and other racialized lives, it is fortuitous that this eminent writer and thinker has been chosen as the 2023 Kreisel Speaker, recognizing the urgent need for words and deeds to refashion our futures like a healer's hand. Let us welcome Wayde Compton to speak on the topic, Towards an Anti-Racist Poetics. Wayde.
So before I flew out here from Vancouver, my daughter said, take some pictures of Edmonton, but it's too cold outside, so that's going to be it. So thanks to those who created the Kreisel Lecture series and have stewarded it over the years, to the Centre for Literatures in Canada, and thanks to Michael for that very fine introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. It's an honor to be asked to speak here, and I'm honored that you came. What I'm going to talk about is race and racism. Years ago, I directed a creative writing program where, though I was the head administrator, I also took it upon myself to do a kind of a diversity prep class beforehand to talk about issues of race and culture that would come up in this year-long creative writing program with cohorts of vastly different people who weren't always used to dealing with that much diversity. And I noticed there were certain issues that came up around race and culture over the years, so I would try to address these early in the year and talk about them. One thing I noticed doing this over and over again is that when you come to talk about racism, it's a bit like walking into a room and putting a loaded gun on the table in the middle of the room and backing up and saying, let's talk. Everybody's kind of half listening to you because they're partly looking at that gun and thinking, is someone going to pick it up? Is it going to get aimed at somebody? Is it going to get aimed at me, right? So I understand, the things that I'm going to talk about are a little bit uncomfortable for people, but I think it will be productive. George Orwell's known for being fundamentally pessimistic, but there's one particular sentence at the end of Homage to Catalonia that I think is really helpful and maybe uncharacteristically optimistic for him. There he says, "The only hope is to keep political controversy on a plane where exhaustive discussion is possible." The only hope is to keep political controversy on a plane where exhaustive discussion is possible. So now I'll begin. Get ready to be exhausted, but productively, right? Toward an Anti-Racist Poetics. Part 1, there's 9 parts. Windows. In 2015, the white American conceptual poet Kenneth Goldsmith read a poem called The Body of Michael Brown at a university event in Providence, Rhode Island. The piece referred to the unarmed black teenager shot and killed by a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, one of the incidents that touched off the Black Lives Matter movement. Goldsmith's performance used the autopsy report for Brown as a found text, and he rearranged it for poetic effect. While the response at the time of the reading was confused, the performance was immediately and rigorously criticized online and later in print as exploitative and disrespectful. On the latter count, it has been noted that Goldsmith reordered the text, so this is the autopsy text of Michael Brown, reordered the text so that the last sentence reads, "The remaining male genitalia system is unremarkable." This performance exemplified Goldsmith's ongoing conceptual method of appropriating extant texts and producing poetry largely free of original writing. What was different about this particular poem was his attempt to engage the topic of race, something that he had not done before. Goldsmith later said that his purpose was to tell the truth and to make a provocative gesture. He also suggested his hope was that the poem would start a discussion. What it indeed started was a fierce backlash against Goldsmith himself by those who considered the performance racist. 2 months later, another white American conceptual poet, Vanessa Place, was similarly criticized for anti-black racism in her work. In her case, attention was drawn to Place's Twitter account where she had been conducting an ongoing appropriative conceptual project for years. In this project, Place uploaded images of the character Mammy from the novel and film Gone with the Wind to her Twitter profile, and as her Twitter header, an image from a poster called Jemima's Wedding Day from 1899. And from the account, Place tweeted sentence by sentence the entire 1937 novel. In a print companion piece, Place published a book composed exclusively of sentences in Gone with the Wind that included the N-word. A chorus of criticism against Place's Gone with the Wind projects grew in wake of their circulation, resulting in the ouster of Place from a committee charged with programming that year's AWP conference. Like Goldsmith, Place was accused of racism, and also like Goldsmith, Place considered her project anti-racist. Place defended herself by saying that her purpose in the project was to provoke the estate of Margaret Mitchell, the deceased author of Gone with the Wind, into suing her for copyright infringement, forcing them to defend the novel's racism, thereby exposing the white supremacy evident in its continued popularity. However, the estate took no legal action, and the result of Place's project was mainly to cause a series of denunciations of Place herself, and at least one digital defense of her work by Ron Silliman, who seemingly without irony called her critics an online lynch mob. As in the case of Goldsmith, the outrage returned home to the author. It is for this latter reason that I would call both of these projects failures, for the misery they caused through their provocations, but also for the way they inevitably centered upon Goldsmith and Place as key discussants. They opened no discussion for people of color that had not already been ongoing. Both writers tried to claim a victory after, merely by the fact that dialogue ensued. But the question should be about whether or not such a project causes productive discussion, for whom that discussion is productive, and at what cost. The idea that merely provoking racial outrage is helpful is akin to Frederick Bastiat's famous economic fallacy of the broken window theory. So that's the erroneous notion that a criminal who smashes windows helps society because he creates business for window makers. Goldsmith and Place are just this fallacious, as each have said respectively of their projects, and this is Goldsmith, the avant-garde loves to destroy things, and I'm an old-school avant-gardist. And Place, sometimes it is the job of art to be offensive. It is enough to ask questions. But where they chose to do their window smashing was in the midst of difficult controversies and atrocities in which black subjects were bound to bear the brunt. And they afterward argued that it was all for the good, because in the cleanup will come some answer, probably. I would argue that rather than being unique, conceptual poetry's racist spring of 2015 was merely a bolder than usual provocation against people of color by an avant-garde that regularly buffets writers of color into positions of resistance, and that these projects were obstructive rather than productive in any frame of anti-racism. None of this so far shows us anything new in terms of poetics. Goldsmith and Place are merely hyper-public reiterations of what so many writers of color engaged with the white avant-garde have known for a very long time, that the white avant-garde is prone to assuming that its fetish for formal innovation is automatically progressive. White avant-garde writers, by whatever name they prefer, postmodern, conceptual, use a nomenclature of alterity, but the effect is the same as the one that perennially produces white normativity in general. Whereas in the dominant society, such normativity plays out in macro-level trends that are like the commanding heights of Eurocentrism, beauty standards, media bias, colonialism, historical master narratives. Within a subculture as esoteric as avant-garde writing, the terms are idiosyncratic but strike the same effect. For example, forms at the end of chains of influence among white writers are usually considered generally innovative. That is, innovative of all possible writing, rather than innovative of merely that particular tradition. And similarly, writing coming from traditions beyond the Western canon that do not resemble white apex forms gets sorted into categories of Western canonical forms, lyric or modernist, whether or not those descriptions fit. And above all, the white avant-garde makes an impregnable fetish of innovation as progressive, and conversely regards tradition generally as regressive and facile. The effect here is to blot out projects of cultural recovery that can be crucial to the progress of writers whose traditions have been forcibly repressed. A further effect of the Western innovation fetish is that white avant-garde writers with this viewpoint will fail to see how they might learn from writers engaged with other traditions, which they regard as temporal cul-de-sacs rather than alternately legitimate chains of influence. In simpler terms, the white avant-garde fails to see itself as an ethnic literature that ought to look at other literatures from that position rather than from the position of being literature as such. All this, I think, explains how Goldsmith and Place, with an otherwise sophisticated appreciation of semiotics, could fail to factor their own identity positions into the semiotics of their own projects. How they each could, astonishingly, not seem to consider that their racial positions counted as positions and would be read as part of their expression. They felt a sense of permission to provoke using racial subject matter without appreciating that, as white authors, their good faith could not be assumed within current social conditions. And I would argue this is because they do not quite comprehend themselves as white artists. As is common of white identity, this solipsism gives them a sense of themselves as free-floating signs, artists without a personal tether to racial or social relations. This lack of self-awareness can be seen in their later justifications. Place, for one, gets it perfectly backwards in an interview when she says, quote, "The controversy over me is not the one that I sought. The problem may be that my poetry engages with systems, including systems of authorship," end quote. But that's not the problem at all. The problem is exactly that she operated with no sense of her own relational author function, as an author who is white in a racialized society. Further on in her own defense, Place likens her work to that of Kara Walker, saying Walker, a Black American visual artist, also uses violent racist imagery to make art about the racial imaginary, saying that Place's project does the same thing. But only one who cannot see that the artist is part of the art could make such a radical mistake. Only one who sees herself as operating outside the idea of position could be so surprised when she is herself positioned. Here, two contradictions of the white avant-garde's value system dovetail to produce such failures of cross-cultural practice. First, the white avant-garde overvalues aesthetic innovation to the point of considering it socially progressive in and of itself, without appreciating the need for relational work between communities. And second, this overvaluation of innovation comes from its own particular aesthetic lineage, rooted in Western modernism that fails to regard itself as a lineage, but rather implicitly positions itself as universal. Where both these contradictions are at work, a true cross-cultural or anti-racist poetry cannot exist. Part 2, Trails. I have never felt that my subjectivity is universal or outside a cultural or racial position. The sensation that one must feel when they're lined up squarely to the norm is something I can only imagine, or maybe that's a lack of a sensation. This is true for many of us in different ways. Those who are born into the governance of the Indian Act, those who are immigrants, those who have suffered a racially biased carceral system, and so on. For me in particular, such a positioning is there at the beginning of my life, in the form of my own transracial adoption at birth. My biological mother is Anglo-Irish Canadian, and my biological father, amberized in the mid-20th century language of my adoption papers, was Negro and Spanish. My birth mother thinks the latter might have been Puerto Rican, but we're not sure. Because she was 19 and unmarried when pregnant with me, my birth mother's family was unsupportive, and she arranged to surrender me to the Vancouver Children's Aid Society when I was born in 1972, and I was adopted by a Vancouver couple shortly after. It's during this time that the governmental documentation of my race began. And in a very real and legal way, my bureaucratic racialization was the primary determinant of the course of my life. At this point in telling my birth and adoption story, I wonder if your instinct is to imagine that I was adopted by white parents. I've noted that that's the usual assumption. It would be a pretty good guess in Western Canada, maybe in Canada altogether, maybe anywhere, but that's not the case. I was adopted by an interracial couple. My mom was, much like my birth mother, Anglo-Irish Canadian, and my dad was an African-American immigrant to Canada who was originally from Texas. They applied to adopt me early in 1972 and had me in their home within a month of applying. To get a newborn that fast is highly unusual, and it was precisely because my mixed race was matched to their interracial identification in the system that I was placed with them. And to be clear, I'm grateful for this policy of racial matching, right? I think it's the right policy. But my point here is that the circumstances of my origins have quite literally been rigorously positional by law and public policy. Every player in my adoption, except for the social workers, are identified by race in my adoption papers. And when I speak here of position, I do so both metaphorically and literally. Where I was housed at birth was determined by my race. I was, through these determinations, officially placed or positioned. While the particular circumstances of my adoption are unusual, I don't think the circumstances of my racialization are. What is unusual, and perhaps illustrative in my origin story, is that due to the official nature of an adoption, the social reality of race for me comes with a pretty long paper trail. The way I'm racialized in this official documentation, I would argue, simply officializes what is otherwise often whispered or wondered about or expressed in euphemisms, polite or hostile, throughout the lives of people of color generally. When we speak of such marginalized identity positions, that spatial metaphor implies a center. To give the metaphor an image, consider a cyclone, a tornado, a hurricane. Those who are excluded from the center are out there on the edge, blown by the tumult of its violent winds. And those in the center are in the eye of a storm, where the calm might lead one to wonder whether or not there is a storm at all. And where does this merge with the matter of reading and writing? The language the social worker used in my official documentation is potent and fateful. At the end of what's called a report on adoption applicants and family, after a long list of requirements fulfilled, the final sentence that created me as a member of what became my family reads, "Recommendation, I am pleased to recommend Mr. and Mrs. Compton as adopting parents for a mixed Negroid male child." So I was there in indefinite article, a mixed-race Negroid male child, not this one, not baby John Doe, say. And I've puzzled over this syntax for 25 years. Were my parents only approved to adopt interracial matching, or is it referring to me specifically? It seems to refer to me specifically, but then also maybe it doesn't. If this adoption had not worked out, would my parents have been approved to adopt a white, indigenous, or Asian child? I have no idea. It sounds like it's exclusionary language. My parents did as they were advised to do and always told me that I was adopted, so it would not be a surprise later, which is good practice. So in my earliest years, when I had questions about my adoption, my mom would take a folded and wrinkled and much thumbed document out of the top drawer in their chest of drawers, and she would read it to me, a text called Background History for Wayde Compton, a brief description of my adoption, including the race and class of my biological parents, written by the Vancouver Children's Aid Society. So there I was in my earliest years being read my position and trying to understand it. This was, I would later see, a type of self-reading not very different from how my parents themselves had to read a room or a street or a border crossing or a police stop or a neighborhood or a city or a country whenever they entered one. We, the people who have been made quite aware of how our positions precede us, become experts at nothing if not that. Lived experience for those who are heavily positioned by power puts the lie to the idea that an individual might ever be an exemplar of aesthetic universalism. My positioning leads me to see position as inevitable. The goal then becomes, how do we relate across these positions when we let go of the goal of building a universal aesthetic? Part 3, camps. The matter of how a writer is positioned culturally and racially can have a collective and vertical aspect. Just as nations do, poetry has its hierarchies, whether official or not. National and social values can intersect with the aesthetic appraisal of literature, and there a centralized zone of bias can form, the eye of the storm that does not feel the wind. In his book, You Must Work Harder to Write Poetry of Excellence, Crafts, Discourse, and the Common Reader in Canadian Poetry Book Reviews from 2012, Donato Mancini makes the case that Canadian reviewers of poetry overwhelmingly write in a particular idiolect, that is, a language of value or ideology. This idiolect, Mancini argues, draws authority from an aesthetic conscience that shuts out the innovations of postmodernity or avant-garde work in favor of an official verse culture. The verse culture favored by this dominant idiolect is, according to Mancini, derived from the putatively stable lyric subject of Romanticism. Poetry that extends the tradition of the lyric I as subject is highly evaluated and often specifically hailed as crafted, that is, properly worked upon, labored over, honed. And this language of craft marbles Canadian poetry reviews and is a rhetoric through which reviewers dismiss or misread that which is avant-garde, procedural, conceptual, or aggregative, rather than rooted in the more recognizable lyric forms. An important metaphor that Mancini uses in this critique is that of two poetry camps, the lyric and the postmodern. So I'll go back and forth between postmodern, avant-garde, experimental synonyms. So the lyric and the postmodern, as he says. And as with camps, he accounts for traffic between the two and is aware that these are porous rather than hard-edged positions. They're not binary opposites, and the boundaries are blurry, but the camp metaphor nevertheless does read as true. But what I'm most interested in here is a qualification that Mancini provides early in You Must Work Harder to Write Poetry of Excellence, and that is his caveat that these camps are not comprehensive and leave out an analysis of, as he puts it, practices of opposition to official verse culture premised and practiced on entirely other terms, end quote. And he specifically mentions racialized poetic practices such as dub, hip-hop, spoken word, performance poetry, indigenous writing, racialized feminist writing, as part of this mysteriously external aesthetic position, external to either camp. Mancini notes that such racialized writing can find itself in these wars of encampment, subject to either silencing or exclusion or adjudicative condemnation or political neutralization by ideological praise. And he notes that any and all of these reactionary or recuperative responses can come from both camps. This latter point is very interesting and brings us back to the cases of Kenneth Goldsmith and Vanessa Place, where I began. The way both these poets are, in the pieces I described, simultaneously avant-garde or aesthetically oppositional to the dominant formal style, yet also aligned quite tightly with the myopia of white normativity. Nor are these two writers the only ones. Neither camp, if camps there are, is free of the problem of a whiteness that falsely universalizes itself time and time again. And in this spatial metaphor, where are we, the racialized poets? Temporary foreign workers in one camp or another, in the alleys or the interstices, across the tracks, outside the fort, beyond the pale, in terra incognita? Part 4, Innovations. While I'm convinced by Mancini's critique of the lyric, craft-based idiolect is often exclusive of non-white poetic forms, and his acknowledgement that both camps can exclude, there's work to be done delineating how the avant-garde can mask white universalism in its own particular methods. Namely, in the white avant-garde's rejection of the lyric subject, there's a generalized, and I would argue white universalized, suspicion of the personal in poetry almost altogether. Out of these Western modernist debates has come a near total rejection of personally inclusive praxis and a strong favoring of scientistic pretenses, hence experimental as one synonym for avant-garde poetry. The conceptual poetry of Goldsmith and Place, for example, steeped as it is in aggregation, heuristic procedures, and tropes of disruption and innovation, clearly descends, at least in part, from the general overvaluing of technocratic pretense. Far from being capacious enough to include all or provide a critique for reading all, I would argue the white avant-garde's tastes are particular and even seem arranged to keep out criticism that might come from lived experience. Its disavowal of the subjective bats away any self-positioning. You can see this taste for the non-subjective and technical in the language Goldsmith uses when he writes of Place's work, previous to her Gone with the Wind project. He writes, Place enacts a documentary poetics, one that subjugates its own moral impulses to pre-inscribed ethical DNA that comes embedded in appropriated language. Then he takes this burlesque of science even further when he posits robo-poetics as a future hope, in which machines write literature meant to be read by other machines, bypassing a human readership entirely, end quote, as a desirable literary end of history. And maybe we're there with ChatGPT. One of Canada's own white conceptual poets, Christian Book, provides a further example of this thinking. Book has taken the trope of experimentation and demetaphorized it in his poem Xenotext, on which he worked for years with scientists, finally succeeding in injecting a literal DNA sequence coded with language that caused a bacterium to produce a similarly coded text in its protein. While on one hand, such a feat is most certainly new and creative, one would be right to ask if there's a value for social relations of any sort attached to it. Book says of the scientific bent to his work, and this is a quote, "I am amazed that poets will continue to write about their divorces, even though there is currently a robot taking pictures of orange ethane lakes on Titan," end quote, and that the moon landing is probably the greatest achievement of any life form on this planet. In the former statement, there's a barely contained hostility to the personal in literature, which he in essence suggests is obsolete. Is the moon landing the greatest human achievement? Or is that democracy, or universal suffrage, or the end of apartheid, or the socialization of medical care, or any of 100 other socially relational achievements? Is achievement better understood within the subjective ways we personally nurture others and ourselves? Or is it essentially technological, in art as in science? Book laments that poets write of their divorces when no one has written poems about the exploration of Titan or the moon landing, saying, quote, "Had the ancient Greeks rowed a trireme to the moon, you can bet there would be a 12-volume epic about that adventure." He says this, missing the irony that the Iliad and the Odyssey are essentially about the threat of divorce in the marriages of Menelaus to Helen and Odysseus to Penelope, right? Neither epic is about technical breakthroughs in transportation. When Book brags, "I'm the poet who does the impossible thing. I am the poet who aspires to have the biggest imagination in the room," you can see how Goldsmith and Place, sharing such an aesthetic pretense, might have inevitably blundered so spectacularly when they attempted to engage with the problem of race relations. It is innovation that their cohort comprehends as the goal, aesthetic innovation, as the goal in and of itself. Imagination is technical rather than socially relational, and so their skills at doing relational imaginative work is blunted. The biggest imagination in the room can't imagine that it's not culturally exceptional. When you start putting together the biases that dominate white avant-garde thinking, what is revealed is a far from anti-racist method, but in fact a startlingly effective phalanx against cross-cultural appreciation in the arts. What sneaks into its formula of cultural taste for innovation is something I'll call temporal exceptionalism. In short, the sense that the timeline of Western culture is the one by which all other cultural timelines must pace themselves, that innovations within Western culture are innovations of all form itself, and that innovations to other traditions are therefore not innovative at all. So it is an example of temporal exceptionalism when one operates as if aggregative appropriation in literary practice, which arises from a chain of influence starting in the modernist West and developing inside new conditions of information transfer, is the furthest form of thought in poetry itself. In this frame, where does one put the poet working in a tradition of dub poetry, or Persian performance poetry, or Cree storytelling, or a poet who innovates those inherited traditions? Chains of influence operate in time through a vast diversity of roots, and they're complex and overlapping. But it is temporal exceptionalism when a Western writer or critic subsumes those sorts of expression by automatic comparison to the Western formal timeline, rendering the literary work that comes from other traditions as usually in the West's past, or occasionally comparable enough to rate a relationship with the latest Western innovative form. On that latter point, the exceptionalism I describe here is itself fraught with particular Western anxieties that are swept up into its false universalism, namely the resonating influence of the dialectic. In Western temporal exceptionalism, tradition exists to be challenged, struck down, and renovated at regular intervals as a given method of culture making. This is put forward as self-evidently progressive, but is really just Western cultural taste. It is in cultures where valuable traditions were violently suppressed and broken that we can see how forward dialectical innovation in culture is not automatically positive. For example, the Pacific Northwest indigenous tradition of the potlatch is something that's both ancient and radically progressive from the point of view of anti-capitalism. The worldviews and traditions that stand outside the Western timeline of influence put the lie to the idea that forward is the only motion that cultural practice should aim itself, or forward only along the lines inscribed in the West. Another example of form outside Western timelines is jazz, which was not suppressed like the potlatch, but rather was taken up by white temporal exceptionalism when it was interpolated as a modernist form. Similarly, there was a moment in the 1980s when some described hip-hop as postmodernist. But these labels obliterate a whole other coherent chain of influences outside Eurocentrism, even when these labels are meant to be complementary. They do not compare lineages, they appropriate them in a cherry-picking manner. Because jazz has some atonalism, it was subsumed awkwardly into a Western frame, although that atonalism arrived through a different influential route. If we consider timelines this way, as diverse rather than as always supplementary to Western exceptionalism, we understand them more fully on their own terms and without such awkward and unnecessary translations. And we can dislodge the Western bias that overvalues temporal innovation, a bias in which the new is automatically regarded as the best. Part 5, orphans. When I first began to think of myself as a writer in my teenage years, I did what many artists of color have done. I mimicked the dominant forms that I encountered in school. This is hardly surprising. Just as W.E.B. Du Bois describes in The Souls of Black Folk, I had an early sense of what he calls double consciousness, the sense of seeing oneself from 2 points of view, from that of the dominant society and one from that of your own. I had a growing interest in reading Black writers and thinking about Black art, and in those explorations saw how these grew out of areas in my own life, such as music and history, that were specific to a Black lineage that I had at least partly inherited. I'd grown up listening to my father's music, blues, R&B, and soul. And when I investigated poets like Langston Hughes and Amiri Baraka, who were using those forms rather than European ones as the basis for their verse, I started to see how I might do that too, how all art wasn't out there, out of the home, and external to me, but could come from somewhere closer and more personal, somewhere that branched from the past up through my own present. Eventually, I began to work with hip-hop as a poetic influence, similar, I hoped, to the way Hughes and Baraka sourced blues and jazz. Before and during this time, I was getting 2 English degrees where I learned, as one does, to read and become familiar with the canon. And I was also during that same time participating in Vancouver's poetic avant-garde scene, the one that was somewhat exterior and independent of the academy, including the Kootenai School of Writing and also less formal organizations and study groups such as Runcible Mountain College and a network of friends and fellow writers and thinkers. Suffice it to say that neither of these spaces, the formal academy nor the avant-garde scene, had much to show me about the Black identified aesthetics I was interested in. I was an academic in training, but in some ways I felt like an autodidact in both my scholarly and creative work. I took directed studies courses on topics my professors knew nothing about. I went to study groups, and instead of saying much, I had private conversations in my own mind about Black writers I was reading because there was no point voicing them in those spaces. I formed some one-on-one relationships with Black writers and artists, but it's not accurate to say there was a coherent Black literary scene in Vancouver then. I found myself navigating a writing career that clearly had at least dual lineages of influence. That there was a universal white standard commanding both the lyric school and the avant-garde was never articulated and would have been disavowed by all. But I could see in the way that my hip-hop interests simply did not fit anywhere, that there had to be a centralization of a singular lineage. I felt it. It was there in the silences. This is not to say I was unsupported, far from it. Some colleagues and teachers made space for me, and the field was full of people who were anti-racist, and many could see that what I was doing had value. But I'm also saying that the underlying assumptions of the field functioned in a way that also made my work aesthetically orphaned. I could see, conversely, that writers whose work did fit easily into lineages that fed from white modernism were welcomed. But others whose work was doing things more inexplicable to whiteness seemed uncategorizable and often, frankly, unwelcome. There was an implicit chain of influence at the center. You held on to that center, you engaged with it, you bent the interpretation of your work to fit it, or you made your lonely way outside it. Part 6, offsets. Lest you think the way for poets of color in Canada is not as lonely as I suggest, perhaps because you read and see the ones that make it through who are, as they say, celebrated, decorated, published, and included at the center of the conversation, right, like such as right now. Thank you for inviting me. Nevertheless, I'd like to look at a few examples, and here I think I can develop some of the gestures that Mancini makes towards outlining the position racialized poets find themselves in, given the Canadian postmodern turn. Even though his topic is the voicing of this ideological rejection of postmodernism, some elements of this apparatus work against racialized poets in similar ways, while other aspects of official verse culture use different gatekeeping methods. But Mancini gives us an excellent example of the latter sense by which the idiolect of official verse culture of the humanist lyric shuts out some indigenous poets and poets of color, even as it means to be sympathetic, and this is interesting. So he discusses Teresa Shea's review of the Cree poet Louise Bernice Half, in which Shea writes, "The poet's language, while at times vibrant and precise, too often reads like prose rather than poetry, while Half's work clearly draws on an oral tradition and might be better appreciated when read aloud, she subjects her poetic voices to the demands of the printed page. Judged by this standard, the subject matter of Blue Marrow is more interesting than the infrequent flashes of poetry." Regardless of technical lapses, the author's emotional involvement and honesty cannot be questioned. Blue Marrow makes a useful contribution to a fuller understanding of Canadian history. It's a book of poetry. As Mancini puts it, though Shea signals sensitivity to Half's cultural and racial context, she finally asserts that universal objective poetic standards must not be waived for racialized writers, lest they gain an unfair advantage in the courts of poetic adjudication. All citizens must stand equal before the law of quality. That's Mancini being spicy, and I'm here for it. This particular response to writers of color and Indigenous writers is something many have noted before, that there's a particular liberal response to racialized writers that seeks to mine their work for its humanizing value to the white subject. It teaches history or it stimulates empathy, but does not recognize it as poetry. The negating result that Mancini described as often emerging from reviews of postmodern poetry, that it is artless, craftless, anti-poetry, is similar here, but with the difference that such a reading will allow that the work of Canadian poets of color might at least be good for us socially, rather than aesthetically. At best, a kind of anti-racist carbon offset phenomenon, whereby the reviewer does not really want to read it, but is happy that it's out there to be read. While Mancini is aware of this as a variant response of the official verse culture, his caveat that both camps can ideologically misread or fail to read poets of color is important too. To put a fine point on it, I've seen avant-garde responses to poets of color that exactly so sees their value primarily for its social use in a way that obliterates its aesthetics, because those aesthetics lie illegibly between camps, as it were. So in this way, the work of outlining ideology in You Must Work Harder to Write Poetry of Excellence arguably does half the work of explaining the mechanisms by which poets of color are devalued in Canadian reviewing culture. The evaluative net cast over Canadian poetry by this dominant idiolect snares many poets of color too, including those we would not necessarily think to call postmodern or avant-garde, though the relationship between postmodernity and some practices by writers of color might feel comparable. For one example, one might consider the erstwhile lyric poems of Gregory Schofield, in which English is interlaced with Cree and sometimes Hebrew, reflecting his mixed-race identity. How lyric is such a lyric whose eye is so unstable? And why would we not count such a deliberate act as conceptual, critical, or open? It certainly is not official verse culture any more than Cree is an official language of this country. So who would allied Schofield's reshaping of the lyric with the dominant type? A poem such as Schofield's Prayer Song for the Returning of Names and Sons, for example, begins with a transliterated prayer song whose phonemes are not referential words, then proceeds in Cree, with English in the margins that teaches us the words in the poem, and then ultimately goes on in a mixture of Cree and English, and finally ends with a footnote discussing the poet's genealogical research and his spiritual conversations with an ancestor. What may at times feel like anecdotal lyricism in Schofield's work is almost always far more complex than that term implies, formally and in terms of its aesthetic and cultural influence. Schofield's poem shows very clearly that there are other sets of aesthetic value at work here, and that they're politically oppositional, culturally specific, and in a conversation with a tradition that's not Western, and he appears to be innovating that tradition. His values are neither those of the dominant idiolect nor of the avant-garde variant. Similarly, the genre of dub poetry features its own values and modes of practice that appear to be nearly unrecognizable to either camp. But we can use Mancini's critique to at least note some important ways that it too disappears in the language of crafts discourse. What Mancini ultimately suggests is that reviewers of postmodern poetry should meet it with new ways of thinking. That's kind of his thesis, right? So rather than falling back on the precepts of the lyric, and that although that's difficult, it's worth the work. And I would say this is also implicitly true for genres that come from non-Western lineages too. To read work cross-culturally, why would it be surprising that you might have to understand the culture first at some depth? Part 7, Poetics. Given all of the above, what might an anti-racist poetics for all look like? What terms would it be predicated on? It would obviously not comprise provocative stunts to outrage, such as those by Goldsmith and Place. It would not depositionalize any given emerging poet from their own cultural milieu. It would not force a fit into one of two poetic camps defined by the specificities of Western literary history alone. From this moment to one in which we disentangle ourselves from a system of aesthetics that is rooted in the fallacy that white culture is universal culture, I would submit three primary exigencies. What an anti-racist poetics would comprise is, 1, interpositionalism, the acknowledgement that there are multiple cultural positions, all of equal value to the communities that audit them. This was identified in the 20th century by Stanley Fish and named social reader response theory. It can and should be adapted to anti-racist practice and criticism by all writers as a way of comprehending work that does not fit into the Western temporal exceptional frame. Fish put forward that no literature is transcendentally good or bad, but rather achieves value when read, and that social groups of readers are the ones who create a collective valuation of any given work. So, for example, an audience raised viewing Japanese no theater as a form will view it with a different set of experiences and values than a first-time viewer would. The familiar audience interprets it should be considered cross-culturally by those first-time viewers before they attempt to evaluate it. This is interpositionalism. 2, temporal interpositionalism. The acknowledgement that the timeline that a given piece of writing is set within, in relation to its own chain of influences, can be of a position other than the Western frame. While it may or may not be innovative within that frame, which may or may not be positive on its own positional terms, it ought to be viewed atemporally, that is, without the innovation bias of Western exceptionalism. So, for example, for a culture in which the recovery of tradition is socially and aesthetically positive, Valuation rooted in other positional experiences of tradition might not be helpful and should not be automatically evoked. 3, personally inclusive praxis. The acknowledgement that in order to listen and communicate across positions, one must begin from a comprehension of one's own personal positioning in relationship to other discussants. Until a reader can identify that their position is indeed a position, rather than a falsely appreciated universalism, then it's unlikely that they'll be able to engage interpositionally and will be prone to misappreciation. Part 8, attritions. On the other side of this theory, what you might have noticed is how it all comes home to one issue, the place of the personal. The debate between camps, as described by Mancini, is largely one about this matter, juxtaposing either a lyric tradition that, Wordsworth-like, explores a thing called the self, or an avant-garde response that wants to trouble the personal, sometimes to the point of outright banishment. What if both are lacking? What if neither covers the whole of human experience? What if we zoom out and notice from a bird's eye view that there are more poets or potential poets outside both camps than there are inside either? The lyric eye that emerges from the Western canon through to a critique that emerges from within the Western canon is still of a piece. So the aggregate conceptual we is Western too, like it or not. If anyone is ethnic, everyone is ethnic. There is no poetry as such, and this can only be appreciated if one acknowledges who one reads, who one values, and who one's writing and scholarship responds to over and above whatever smattering of tokens one might find on one's bookshelf. Could there be a universalist poet or critic? Only if one had several lifetimes to study and become expert in all the traditions there are. Given that's impossible, do the next best thing and let the fallacy of universalism in literature go. I often wonder if some academics believe the seeming balkanization of interests among young scholars is automatic or unthinking. Black students wanting to study Black writers, Asian students wanting to study Asian writers, etc. We used to call this identity politics, which became pejorative. I wonder if they see this trend and worry that it's merely tribal. But it can be more about survival. Foregrounding one's position when ensconced in a dominant order of aesthetic valuation can be a way of ungaslighting oneself from this racism without racists. To converse with a community of writers in one's own aesthetic lineage who might only be accessible through research rather than direct contact. Perhaps the less considered side of this de-universalization is that of the white writer or scholar who begins from their own position, whichever writers they are reading, whichever camp or line of inquiry they are conversing with in their work. The change might look like many things, but most of all, I think it will look like opening a gate one may not have realized one was volunteering to guard. And it has to be noted that many writers of color manage these challenges successfully, and so one might say triumphantly, look at the multicultural plurality of art there is, see the great successes, and therefore suggest that it can all work out in the end. But does it always? Does it mainly work out for the lucky or the privileged among us? I can see how I'm both those things. Does it mainly work out for the survivors for whom it might not have worked out, or even should not have worked out? It feels like that applies to me sometimes too. Are there writers of color left behind along the way? The ones who saw no space for themselves inside a supposedly universal thing called poetry, and who left the field altogether? The answer to that is a definite and sad yes. In this racism without racists, the attrition is rendered nearly invisible, but I know it's real. We lose writers this way. We lose scholars. We're less because of ideologies of universalism, not more. 9, this is the last section, traditions. In his 1919 essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, T.S. Eliot famously puts forward his notion, best summed up in the sentence perhaps most often quoted from it, that what happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art that preceded it. Therein might be a way of daylighting one's own position. Take a poem written today by a white Canadian who mainly reads white poets and ask if it alters the perception of those poems or texts or forms that lie outside the European tradition. It likely does not. And there is your de-universalization in practice. If you can note the disconnection, if you can see that one tradition's reach is not assumptive of all, so traditions plural and individual talents plural. In Jamaica in the early 1970s, a new art form was brewing. In some ways, you might argue it was a form that grew in the wake of an industrial byproduct, the dub side of a record. Jamaica, though a small country, has one of the most vibrant recording industries in the world. And when a single came out on a record, if a band had no second track to sell, they would often simply put an instrumental version on the B-side, a dub or double of the song, but with no vocal. DJs would use these dub tracks to back them when they spoke, hyping up their audience with their best improvised oratory. The better ones did this in a way that was poetic, euphonous, and meaningful. Its roots were in an oral culture extending out of Africa and across the Middle Passage, its rhythms, technologies of survival. Some elements in the island's left-wing student movement saw in this form a way of transmitting social criticism. A poet named Mikey Smith is often credited as the first one who developed, out of these conditions, something that would later be called dub poetry and would spread from the Caribbean to the UK, to the USA, and to Canada. In the USA, specifically in the Bronx, Clive Campbell, also known as DJ Kool Herc, is often credited for creating hip-hop in its earliest moments. He was a Jamaican immigrant and was developing those same early formal admixtures, and in this way it could be said that hip-hop branched off from the same root as dub poetry. By the later 1970s and 1980s, artists like Linton Kwesi Johnson in the UK made dub poetry an international phenomenon. It was sometimes musically backed, sometimes not, but always rooted in oral delivery, always politically motivated, and vibrating with the sounds of reggae syncopation in its meter. Canada became one of the key centers for dub poetry. Lillian Allen, Clifton Joseph, and later Debbie Young developed the form in Toronto and Montreal. When I heard these poets from way over in Vancouver, and as I grew up through the phenomenon of hip-hop, I decided to engage with each through a turntable poetry project that lasted in performance for about a decade. I recorded my own poetry onto dub plates, temporary acetate records, again, the industrial material of radio station culture. The innovation I wanted to experiment with was to disembody the spoken word artist or poet, to put the voice onto the record where it might be acted upon through mixing and recombining sounds on various turntables. As the MC figure in hip-hop rose in fame and celebrity, I worried about how this creeping individualism seemed to supersede some of the more political and social elements of the culture. And I wondered if formally displacing the poet's voice in such a way, turning my vocal performance into one material among many other sound sources, might produce theme and make some meaning about the state of my culture and the function of the poet in it. The project is documented in my second book, Performance Bond, and in essay form in After Canaan, and in a smattering of incidental video recordings on the internet. Whether or not this experiment was successful is for others to decide, but I summarize it here to show you a lineage, a chain of influences, a poet not operating comfortably within camps that he encountered along the way. Would a well-crafted lyric in Canada today, pick any, from a poet in the lineage of the anecdote, or an avant-garde poet emerging from the influence of Gertrude Stein or Jack Spicer, would either be able to show you how their work recasts the formal explorations of the Jamaican dub poets? While literature and art is heterogeneous, and we can and should read and feel influenced across cultures, it's equally true that our readings are relative to our knowledge of those cultures and our personal proximity to them. My argument is not to keep lineages rigid, but rather to appraise them honestly. It is to say they should not be subsumed and taken over by forms that a dominant society masks conveniently as universal. And what I think can come from this way of thinking is a validation of those whose poetry holds aesthetic and cultural value that will not always be immediately legible to those steeped purely in the canon or its critical derivations. And I think there is also something to be gained for poets and critics of the dominant culture. Namely, it offers a permission to step back, to learn, to hold back on an adjudicative impulse in favor of making space for that which is not well understood. Evaluation might give way to an education in form, an expansion in genres, and may do away with camps in favor of a constellation of positions in relation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that provocative and capacious lecture, Wayde. We do have time for some questions. Maybe as we're collecting our thoughts, I might throw out a question of my own. I was teaching the Outer Harbour in my Canadian literature class last semester. There's a beautiful, the second story in that collection has this wonderful island appear off the coast of Vancouver. It's sort of reserved as an ecological territory, right? Nobody's allowed to go there except for scientific investigation, but it's called Pauline Johnson Island, and this group of activists work to take a boat out to this island and want to stage a kind of anti-colonial protest. One of the people in this community doesn't identify as Indigenous. The rest of the activists are all Indigenous, but this one community member is really questioning whether or not they should be there. In the second part of your lecture, you talked about that, like, how do we build community without relying on the universal, and how do we build communities while still acknowledging our positionality, our differences. And so I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit, perhaps, on where you see those spaces of coming together without collapsing, of forming, of communities that can work towards social change, which you talked about as advancement, but that's not technological. How to find that space of community that's still positional.
I write a little bit about my experience in the Vancouver scene in the 90s. Like, I call it racism without racist, because everybody was really nice. And everybody was, anti-racist in their, regular practices. And to me, it was almost, it's not so much what people were writing, that's fine. I acknowledge there are these lineages, sure. If you're writing in this modernist lineage and you're responding to that, then that's great, go to town. But it was more in the manifestos and this kind of, the paratext to the actual work often is where I was sort of stunned by that kind of, universalizing effect, those kind of grand statements about what this was doing, calling language poetry the new sentence, or these sort of sweeping, suggestions of what this was able to achieve, or, how total it should be, right? And so in a way, I think it's the dropping of that. Like, it's fine, just don't consider it, this kind of grand sweeping movement that we all have to become part of, right? And so I think once that happens, people would be more likely to let other voices in, because they're not looking at their work as this project that is supposed to be this kind of final end of history or something like that. So it's a weirdly, drop the eschatology of what your aesthetics are, and just say, this is what I do, or this is what I see. Because that's how I write. I mean, that's how I think most minority writers write. We don't think, nobody thought dub poetry was going to take over the world and everybody's going to write like this now. They didn't want to, that wasn't the point, really. The point was to do what they were doing within the space that they were creating. So I think that's where it works. So it would really look like kind of opening up that invitation to others by dropping that kind of like heightened language of, this is what everyone should do.
I'm a poet. My name is Shima Robinson. I'm from Humisquachi, born and raised. I am keenly interested in thinking about and hearing your opinion or your thoughts on ways to open permissive or braver space that could nurture the recognition of the existing constellations of these sort of cultural positions that are channeled into verse or words or whatever people use to do that. I guess I will contextualize the question with having been born here and raised here, first generation Canadian from Jamaican parents. I found coming up as a poet that there was very little space to exist as a poet, as a voice. The margin was the shiny place. That was very exciting and cool, but completely unexplored, left to its own devices. And as a person who then embodied the margin in some way, I was a lonely. I'm interested in how to build institutional and cultural emphasis, appreciation, and value for what you've just posited.
Yeah, exactly what you're saying. I recognize that experience exactly, right? That's it. It's this feeling that, people are not saying, well, when they review, they are sometimes saying it's bad work. but generally not. When you're there in those communities, it's more of a weird kind of ignoring. It's sort of like a disengagement with the work. That's why this talk is directed at everyone, I think, because I think it's a project where we need everyone to actually be thinking about this. It's possible to think of it from the point of view of, you're in a minority position, or you're writing whatever your particular form is, and it's not in either one of those camps. It's possible to have the strategy of, well, then remove from those camps and create an alternate institution. Create a writing group of people who are like you, who are doing the thing you're doing. But then that doesn't really work, because that also gets marginalized. Like I talk about the kind of national level of these things. If you look at dub poetry, right? The dub poets that lobbied the Canada Council to create grants for spoken word, those didn't exist before. It was Lillian Allen and Clifton Joseph who were saying, what we're doing is a legitimate form, but we're poets in Canada. That's what we're doing, is poetry. But we are not eligible to get any of these grants because our work is audio work, right? Now that's there, right? But that was after a long activist struggle. I think that's what has to happen. I think it does have to be all of us. I think this is directed at people writing in either of those camps, which is a fine thing to do. But it's, you need to be able to recognize, okay, well, if I am a gatekeeper in some capacity, like I have the opportunity to offer people to review work, say, or to program a show or a series or whatever, think about opening that up. And if you don't have the knowledge to figure out what work is out there, then bring in, a diversity of people who can do that. Right? So.
Okay, thank you.
I was really interested in how you started off talking about that indefinite pronoun, coming to understand yourself as, when you were adopted, as sort of a interracial kid, or being adopted, or just like any, or this particular one. If you could talk a bit about finding yourself on paper that way, and if you've made anything out of that material that you found. You said you thought about it for years.
Yeah, I included it because, I wanted to come at this issue from a variety of angles. The theory that I was trying to develop, Mancini's a really, really interesting critique, and then the personal, and that's where the personal starts for me, right? I think it's not that unique to people of color. Being scrutinized is not a unique experience to me. That's something that people of color go through all the time. But mine is weird because it's got this big thwack of documents, showing exactly that. I'm writing elsewhere. I'm writing an essay about the whole experience of being adopted. And in that, I look at my adoption papers as a text. So I use my training, my academic training, my exegetical training to examine that as a text, because it's a really strange layered text. There's a bunch of weird things going on in those documents. There are drafts, like background history for myself that I've told you about. That's the description of my adoption, right, that I grew up knowing. That's the one they send you off with into the world, so you know a little bit about your biological origins, or at least the Children's Aid Society did that. It was in my 20s, and I applied for my adoption records because they were finally opened up, again, after some activism from adoptees, right? Mine was a closed adoption. I was supposed to never know anything about any of this stuff, but that was opened up, and so I applied to get my adoption papers. In the adoption papers, I saw that background history, the one I knew. I was like, oh, there it is, that's the thing. And then flipped the page and saw the longer first draft, and was blown away that what I got was a condensed version of an interview with my birth mother, which is much, much longer and much, much messier. There were lies, essentially, the social worker rewrote the story. That's not from my birth mother's word, that's from my own eyes. She wrote down what she said and looked at it and thought, well, this kid would probably prefer this story. And so kind of made it nicer. So in that, I go more deeply into the weird, the uncanny nature of reading yourself as a kind of text, or even just reading the social workers describing my mom and dad in these strange terms. There's scrutiny of them and really inexplicable things, like my mom, very, very Catholic woman, identified herself to the Children's Aid Society as Anglican. And I was like, what? That's the weirdest. If you knew her, you would know she's not Anglican. And then I figured out that it was, back then they adopted kids out by religion. A baby was put into the system from a Catholic mother. The baby was Catholic and was preferred to go with Catholic. So there was not just racial matching, but also religious matching that way. So I think she was trying to make sure she got a kid, right? Which was, there were more Anglican babies, I suppose, in the system than Catholic in Vancouver at that time. And going into it, it's weird work, but yeah.
Is that a piece coming out soon, or it's a ways away? Or do you know where it's coming out?
It's coming out in Brick,
Awesome.
Brick magazine this summer.
Cool, thanks.
I noticed you mentioned the word class in conjunction with race at one point in your talk. And I wondered how much you think the concept of high and low art play into this. Like, for instance, Ken Loach and Michael Lee use English dialects in their home country in their films deliberately, and sort of non-actors as a sort of social statement, I guess. And I notice you have a graphic novel, which again wouldn't be sort of considered high art, I suppose, depending on how it's done. I wondered how you thought that figures into it, or how important it is.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think not one that I address here, so maybe that's a place to develop, right? Because that's true. You know, and also, like, you know, what's high and low, you know, I mean, to me, hip hop is a culture, right? It's a cultural form. I was taking my cue from what Langston Hughes and Amiri Baraka were doing. You know, they were saying that. They were saying, you know, the blues and jazz are, maybe they begin as folk forms, but these are art forms, right? These are American art forms. They're worthy of developing from, right? And so that was my attitude about hip hop too. But true enough, you know, considered a not high art form. It depends though, right? I think there's a big diversity there. So minority writers that are using their culture as source material, sometimes that's going to be looked at as low culture, sometimes high culture from just other countries, right? Where, you know, this is a parallel kind of high form. So I think it maybe just depends, but that's a really interesting question.
Well, thank you so much. Please join me. One last round of applause for Wayde Compton.